Good morning, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to give this grand rounds. Jimmy mentioned it may be my 37th. We just really guessed that number. But the bottom line is it feels like the first. And why does it feel like the first? It's because I'm as anxious as I was the first, actually a little less, but as I was when I gave the very first grand rounds. This is really special for me. Firstly, I'd like to thank our patient today for coming. One is she's wonderful. Two is she can describe what she's gone through so clearly, and I'm even more thrilled that she's doing better at the moment. That is really the most thrilling thing. And thank you again for coming. I'm also very pleased to hear, mostly exclusively from our patient today, how our residents through our clinic have really taken care of patients who've been struggling and have been exceedingly helpful, and that gives me a great deal of joy. I myself am useless at behavioral therapy. But more, there's so many things I want to say, but the other thing is thank you, Dr. Wong, for being so able to present our patient today, and for the wonderful work you've done. I met Dr. Wong, I think it was my last inpatient attending era, and I thought she was the best medical student I had come across, and I hope my recommendation for her acceptance in the residency had some impact. I can't stop. Dr. Lehman mentioned, thank you very much for the music today. It was wonderful. And Dr. Lehman mentioned that the last time she played, I think at Hopkins or in public, was in our day hospital. And it reminded me of that location where I'd worked for so many years. And that was a joy to hear as well. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking, as this title says, about OCD risk factors. And I've reported it or stated it as a review. Starting out, let me say that when I completed my residency, which wasn't so recent, I have to add, I knew nothing about OCD. I don't think I'd seen a case, maybe one. We never, ever discussed OCD to my recall. We did discuss compulsive personality quite a lot. And in fact, several of our faculty had written papers on that subject. One in particular that they were very excited about was its relationship to somatization disorder. In fact, I think that there was an implicit understanding that OCD was an extreme form of compulsive personality. I think that was the view. And I think that came from Aubrey Lewis, who trained Dr. McHugh at the Maudsley, and I think that was the origin of that thinking. Anyway, I then went to work with Dr. Rudolf Hunsarik, who was conducting the first clinical trial of a medication for OCD, clomipramine. And in that trial, which I was grateful and pleased to be included, I met patients with OCD, and I was woken up to what this condition was. And I really found both it fascinating and two, really sad and difficult, but it really ended up, I believe, in me starting a career in the realm of OCD, which I've actually continued until the present time. Well, as Jimmy mentioned, I did a fellowship in psychiatric epidemiology, so it was obvious that I should be thinking about things like prevalence and risk factors when it came to any condition I was studying. So, well, first let me do what I was meant to do right in the beginning. I have no disclosures to present. My objective is very simple, to identify key genetic, biological, and environmental risk factors of OCD as we know them. But back to risk factors. Firstly, let me briefly just remind everyone what we're talking about today, and that a risk factor is any behavior, condition, inherited trait, or environmental factor, exposure, that increases a person's likelihood to develop a particular condition. We usually measure it based on a risk ratio, and the risk ratio is the risk in an exposed group, that is individuals with the condition under question, compared to a risk in an unexposed group. A very important issue that sometimes gets forgotten in this work is that you should only use it for incident, or you should try to use it for incident cases. Why? Because prevalent cases are confounded by duration, so that incident cases will prevent the effect of duration. Also, it does reduce recall bias if you're only talking about incident cases. Now, why are we interested in risk factors? We're interested because we're interested in disease prevention, like targeting our prevention programs. We want to identify vulnerable programs to focus on in dealing, in allocating resources. But really what I'm interested in is causation, and that these risk factors, we can hopefully develop an understanding of the causes of these conditions. And ultimately, for our clinician work, it does enhance clinical decision making. Before we move on, let me remind you all about what we're talking about, and that is obsessions and compulsions, just to be sure we're on the same page. I think the phenomenology is critical. It's unbidden thoughts that intrude and are difficult to expel, even though we recognize in many cases, or most cases, that they are irrelevant or not real. Compulsions are actions that can be behavioral or mental. Let's not forget mental, where the actual thoughts are the compulsions that you're going through in your mind, or reviewing what's been going on in your life, for example, and the person feels compelled to do. They're compelled to do really because of the severe anxiety that the obsessions produce and the desire to rid oneself of that terrible anxiety. Okay, so what are the earliest conceptualizations of OCD risk? In the 19th and early 20th century, we really thought about obsessional neurosis. We thought about, and particularly psychoanalytic theory was pretty prominent and prevalent, and we thought that these symptoms were arising from intrapsychic conflict or personality structure. Again, the assumptions, let me just make sure I can use this. The assumptions were basically that there was a psychological cause, and there was not much consideration about biological vulnerability. So what about prevalence? I told you I was interested in that. Well, prior to 1980, which is about my era, just as at my era, the estimates were reported to be about 0.05%. Hard to believe. And it actually conforms to what our patient today said, and that no one before this period was recognizing OCD, treating OCD, etc. But then suddenly, it was quite sudden, a paper came out from the ECA study, the Epidemiologic Catchment Area Project, which I was fortunate to be involved in, that described the rates to be about 2 to 3%, which, as you can see, is substantially higher. So what were the implications? Substantial. Suddenly, from a rare, irrelevant condition, this is now suddenly we're talking about a common condition. Suddenly, the pharma industry, the medical industries, were interested in this. Hence the clomipramine study I mentioned earlier. I had actually used clomipramine in South Africa 10 years before the study, but we were using it, suddenly we were doing it here in the United States. And finally, research funding became viable. There was no, and in fact for many years even after this, there was very little support for research in OCD. What are the potential risk factors? Firstly is PANDAS, if I can remember, it always drives me a little crazy thinking about this, psychiatric and neurological disorders associated with strep. And this is really either an infectious or an immunological issue that we're talking about. Other factors could be perinatal problems, hormonal effects, and familial pattern. And I'll briefly review each one of these for you. The first one is PANDAS, or PANS. They changed the name after a while to ensure that streptococci were not the exclusive domain of this situation. How do we define or see this disorder? It's this immensely acute onset in the context of preceding infection. This onset is amazing and surprising. A healthy young kid wakes up, everything's good, wakes up the next morning and has severe disabling obsessions and compulsions. I've seen this, and it really is dramatic. Not common, but it's dramatic. Unfortunately, everybody who has OCD now wants to think that the condition was due to PANDAS, and certainly doesn't want to think about genetics or other factors. So we think, well, people believe that it's an autoimmune disorder. There are lots of treatments have tried, but really essentially the treatment is the treatment of OCD. And it as a syndrome remains controversial. There are many people that it's debated, some people not really happy with the condition. There is other autoimmune evidence for OCD, just to mention it very quickly. There are studies showing antibasal ganglia antibodies. There are studies showing cytokine dysregulation. There's antidopamine receptor antibodies. And there's also epidemiological evidence. And today we have an example of such a thing, where certain autoimmune disorders, there's an increased prevalence of OCD. Again, this is an association, not a causation, as we keep mentioning. And our patient today mentioned or has multiple sclerosis, which, for all we know, may in some fashion be related. What about perinatal events? There's really not much data. This table comes from a study conducted at the Karolinska, obviously in Sweden, using the Swedish register. So they have hundreds of patients. You see here the numbers, what, 1,500,000. You need registers to get such numbers. And you see, with regard to the number of perinatal events going from 0 down to greater than 5, you can see let's use this one, the adjusted odds ratio, or hazard ratio actually. It's not substantial, but significant and increasing as the number of perinatal events increases, suggesting that perinatal events are in some way related to the origin. We certainly know that, we've actually found that people who've had jaundice as a perinatal, in the neonatal period do have an increased risk. Makes sense because it's affecting the basal ganglia. Now, what about pregnancy? Well, we got very interested in pregnancy, and in fact have a research grant and research study in collaboration with UNC going on at the moment, in which we've looked at the increase in onset and exacerbation. We're really looking at lots of things. With UNC people are more interested in the descriptive thing, the other people we are more interested in the biological things, and we're still looking at hormones and immunological factors. We haven't really established anything. But, hey, wrong button. Sorry. But I love this figure, so I have to show it to you. This is the trajectory. We're following people from 20 weeks through to 6 months postpartum. Rochelle Muskie was the one who actually produced this, working mental health department, as working as a statistician with us. And it really shows that when we do general growth mixture modeling, please don't ask me today to explain that to you. I obviously can, but I just don't want to. Anyway, we found using a 3-group solution, we find that there's some individuals who had OCD symptoms right in the beginning, some individuals and stays that way. Some individuals didn't have it in the beginning and stays that way. But there's this interesting group that you can see clearly from 20 weeks onto 6 months is increasing over time. Again, very consistent with the idea that pregnancy is in some ways both exacerbates existing OCD and has incident cases of OCD. Genetics, which is what really I focused on. So just to remind everyone, there'd be how we look at genetics. It starts with twin studies, often with twin studies, and you show that among where they monozygotic twins, you get a concordance of about 47 to 65% compared to half in dizygotic twins, which are the equivalent of siblings, as we all know. So this discrepancy is the evidence that we look for to suggest that there's a genetic basis. There are several other genetic studies. Now, we were behind the times. These people were, including myself a little bit, were doing genetic studies in bipolar disorder, depression, schizophrenia, and poor OCD. We were lagging way behind everybody. We wanted to do it, and IMH said to us, well, hey, you don't have proof that this is a familial condition. What are you wasting our time for? That's exactly what we got. So we had to do a family study, and this is the Hopkins OCD family study. And here we show quite clearly that the odds, case relatives compared to control relatives is what the comparison is. And we find this significant effect that being a relative of a case shows that there is more likelihood of having OCD in a relative, so that OCD is not solely psychological, but has this heritable component. Yay, we can move on to genetic studies. We also learned a lot phenomenologically from that study. I have to mention our patient is really so kind to have mentioned that her family was involved in our studies. Again, very grateful to that. We worked hard to recruit people, and we did find many people were very happy to work with us. This is a genetic linkage study, and you're all shocked to hear me talk about linkage studies in 2026 because they sort of take us back a long way. But I just wanted to show that even when we were doing linkage studies, at this stage we had a collaborative group that we developed. But anyway, when we did linkage studies, we found on chromosome 9p24 some strong association with this particular gene, SCL1A1, a neuronal glutamate transporter. Probably would have forgotten about it, except in other groups around saw what we did and suddenly were able, this is Evelyn Stewart, this is Toronto OCD group, this is ourselves, were able to replicate that there's something going on in that region. And even though this was years and years ago, people are still involved in studying this, and it's probably a very likely thing. So what did we do? Hopkins developed this collaborative group of 5 academic centers to conduct genetic linkage and their association studies. Our initial GWAS identified a marker, again on chromosome 9. This was PTPRD, a protein tyrosine phosphatase receptor. Again, very likely potential association at a very significant level. And subsequently, we were working with the largest group, but our largest group was just about 1,000 or 1,500 people. We needed thousands. So we joined together, we actually formed the OCD group of the PGC, or Psychiatric Genetics Consortium, and today, or the most recent state, there are 53,000 cases of OCD and obviously many, many controls. I have to mention that some of these cases are from 23andMe, and I have some questions about those cases, but nevertheless, let's move on. That we were able now in this era to identify 30 genome-wide significant loci. And I just show that to you, this is the Manhattan plot. Obviously, well, not obviously, but these above this red line, these green diamonds. I guess they're diamonds. I don't know if they're diamonds in the rough. I don't know what that really means. But were the significant findings in an association study of OCD. We went on to collaborate with Columbia University and conducted whole exome sequencing. Again, we haven't got massive samples. This was 1,300 individuals coming out of our group. And we found a significant odds ratio with this gene, SLTRIC5, which had been reported in the many years before and in animal studies as related to OCD. We also looked at de novo loss of function mutations in loss of function intolerant genes. That means genes that, if they are deleted or have a problem, that'll cause trouble. I guess that's the best way to describe it. And de novo implies we use trios here so as to see whether these findings were new and not related to an inherited basis. And yes, we did find that there were an excess of these loss of function genes in the individuals. And these data now support the contribution of rare coding variants to OCD, leading to much more studies. And here's the next process. This is a group, actually they used most of the sample in the OCD group came from us, by the way. I love being boastful. It's terrible, please forgive me. But anyway, these blue dots are all the rare coding variants that they identified in OCD in that study. They were actually interested in CTD, which stands for chronic tick disorder. So they were interested in the relationship, and as you can see, there is a relationship. Some of the same genes are involved in these things, as OCD and chronic tick disorder. So we're moving ahead. I guess the point of all this work is not to say, hey, yay, we found a gene, we can now solve the problem, we can treat people with OCD. This is just the process one has to go through in order to get to the point where we will ultimately find the gold, or the diamonds. Yeah. Okay, so moving on. Oh, I'll have to speed. Talk too much. Reducing heterogeneity. Obviously, we've been talking about OCD. If I'm talking too fast, I hope that doesn't bother you, but I'm going to. Obviously, if we're going to look for OCD, we're talking about this huge assumed homogeneous group. But that's nonsense. Chances are that it's not homogeneous. If we're looking for a disorder, it's likely to be heterogeneous. There's likely to be subgroups within that. So we look for them, and we've used OCD symptom subtypes as a way of looking for them. We've used comorbidities because OCD is so highly comorbid. Are the other conditions related to this? And so we've looked at this. This is one example of looking at comorbidities. We did latent class analyses on all our cases. And ultimately, using this method, we found 3 classes. And just to make it quick and short, one class really seemed to be comorbid with tic disorders, again, consistent with what people think. The other, more enough affective related with bipolar disorder and depression. I'm going to skip symptom. We found symptom dimensions important. We found association, genetic associations. We found a linkage study with hoarding. But really the next area that we moved on to, or that I moved on to, was looking for an endophenotype, because we felt, and have felt for 20, 30 years, I don't know how many years, that ultimately the symptoms are just an epiphenomenon. Deep down inside, there's obviously there must be some trait that is really underlying or provides the vulnerability for this disorder. So the cognitive inflexibility, response inhibition, hyperactive error monitoring are all traits that several investigators have identified and are thinking about in OCD. all as relate to frontostriatal circuits, which is where we think the action is in OCD. We, on the other hand, got very interested in doubt, and we define doubt as a subjective uncertainty about one's perceptions and recall memory, which can impair decision-making. So it's a decision-making problem, ultimately in the we wanted to think, in the physiology of decision-making. So we developed a scale, and here we show that the blue is people who have no OCD, and the red is people who have OCD. And you can see that our scale shows that people with OCD score much higher on this specific scale. We then did physiologic studies, and here's one where we used a decision-making task, which we put to the people with OCD and people without OCD, which actually coincides with high and low doubt in these participants. And using drift diffusion modeling, which is a method that is employed in studying decision-making, we were able to show that individuals with high doubt or OCD seem to have significantly more difficulty and slow speed making these decisions. We also went on and did imaging using the same decision-making method, and here Dr. Arnold Backer, really led this, and we were able to find that in the inferior parietal lobe, right and left, we were able to see that activation was different in the high doubt group compared to the low doubt group. So we really found some physiological or brain neurophysiological evidence for this. Well, I nearly finished on time. So what are our future directions? Really there's several, many. Ultimately, treat people with OCD. Let's put it blankly. But we're trying to get there. We're trying to identify subtypes using genetics, using brain circuits, using symptom profiles, which I didn't discuss today. We're looking for endophenotypes, which will be intermediate markers, which will help us sort out what to look for, and ultimately also gene-environment interaction, understanding how genetic vulnerability and developmental stresses combine to produce OCD. So to end, let me thank this many people. When I was writing this down, I didn't realize there were this many people. There's so many people on our faculty, there's only faculty members, who have really contributed in some part to these studies. I'm not going to read every name, but I thank all of you. Everybody really helped an immense amount. I don't mention the staff members who actually were absolutely important, but the slides just don't permit me going through all the names. And before I end, thank you. I've got one plea, and I realize I was going to say this, and I'm not going to be popular saying this. The plea is, when one does a mental status examination and says there are no obsessions and compulsions, please be sure that you've actually asked whether there are obsessions and compulsions. And if you write down, if you've identified obsessions and compulsions, don't just have in the mental status examination because it's wrote no obsessions and compulsions. Thank you for listening to my fast and rambling talk.
That was very, very, very well done. Very interesting, Jerry. You mentioned obsessive-compulsive personality a couple times, but you didn't reference data on it. I suppose two related questions are, is obsessive-compulsive personality a risk factor for OCD? And whether or not it's a risk factor, do they have a relationship to each other?
Yes. Thank you for asking that. I would have included it, but time did not permit. Yes. There's a far higher rate of OCPD at different score levels in people with OCD compared to those that aren't. But there are a lot of people with OCD, in fact more than 60%, who will not score anywhere on an OCPD scale. So again, it gets us back to the subtypes, and I believe there probably is an OCPD type of OCD and one that isn't.
That's interesting. That number is helpful. 60% of people with OCD don't have any obsessive compulsive personality
I'm using
traits.
a scale.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
Very low, let's say.
That's interesting. Thanks. Dr. Bienvenu.
Dr. Nestadt, you talked about the interesting phenotypic features that we identified during the family study. And I don't think anybody's really done that much with twin studies to follow that up. But Dr. Pius just mentioned OCPD, but it's one of many traits that run in families of people with OCD. I wondered what you thought were the interesting things that came out of that.
I'll just repeat, you want to talk about other things that co-occur with OCD from the family study?
Yeah. Well, the slide I mentioned of the Latin class actually mentions it. But for this audience, let me mention that Dr. Bienvenu was a prominent co-investigator in that family study. So he knows the answer. And he published very reprinted, whatever the word is, I can't think of the word, papers about that subject. Including what were the impulse control disorders were very highly, more common in people with OCD. That includes trichotillomania, hair pulling, nail biting, even body dysmorphic disorder, which wasn't really in that impulse control, is in a different group. We also found anorexia, nervosa to be higher in this group. And interestingly, when people have done genetic studies of anorexic nervosa across all the genetic disorders studied in psychiatry, anorexia and OCD seem to share a great deal of the genetic variants. I mean, I can go on, Dr. Bienvenu, of other related disorders, but thanks for bringing that up.
No, that's great. That's great. Dr. Nestadt the younger.
Excuse me. How were my slides? This man told me I don't know how to do a slide. He has to do them for me. Anyway, he didn't.
But he wouldn't let me. I would have done common sense fun. But what I'm wondering is, so you talk about the very low perceived prevalence decades ago, and then it goes up to these days. But these days, it seems to me that OCD still is misdiagnosed, both under and overdiagnosed, maybe more than other common psychiatric conditions. What do you think makes OCD so hard for many psychiatrists to either recognize or over-recognize? What is it about your diagnosis?
I'll just repeat the question. What makes OCD so hard to correctly diagnose? It seems to be both under and over called.
Two answers in both directions. The under recognition is something that's really well known to people, and that is the embarrassment and hiding of symptoms by people with OCD. The over diagnosis is, and that's great, is a lot of OCPD. I mean, we all know it when we go to a cocktail party that everyone says they're OCD at our cocktail parties. Not that I go, but
When they really mean they're OCPD-ish.
I mean they're OCPDs. Yeah, they may check something. Exactly. Thank you, Jimmy. I guess those are the main reasons that I can come up with.
Thanks. Dr. Margolis.
Can you comment on cell and animal models, potential value, past, present, future?
How about cell and animal models?
Yeah, there have been several animal models. I mentioned the Slitwick one. They're very, and off the top of my head, I don't remember all of them. There are several, none have really passed muster. There are people that are still working on them, and truthfully, I'm not involved and don't know enough. But an absolutely important area, though as with all animal models, difficult to use with regard to what we know about the phenotype of these conditions.
Dr. Morrow.
Thanks so much. The therapies in OCD are broad, from psychotherapy, cognitive therapy,
Yeah,
Could these endophenotypes help us to get more targeted therapy?
absolutely, and I do hope so. Already people, talk about Tourettic OCD. They talk about every kind of OCD, but this Tourettic OCD, people with tic disorders. We have thought all along that certain neuroleptic medications would be more effective in that group than in other groups. I unfortunately haven't found that particularly, but that is exactly the hope that we will be able to find that.
Thanks. Dr. Al-Zamzami.
Having served on the DSM working group, wondering about the OCD being pulled out of the anxiety disorder category classification into its own kind of entity. The background of that, and was it helpful, not very helpful clinically, the implications of that?
Talk about OCD being pulled out of anxiety in DSM.
When you're meeting lots of people, you'll find in the OCD world, you find that all the behavioral psychologists are mad, angry about that decision, and they feel that anxiety is such a prominent feature of OCD that it should remain in the OCD domain. On the other hand, and there's one other thing that's really important I haven't mentioned to date, and that is generalized anxiety disorder. It's probably the highest comorbid condition of OCD. And in both comorbid, and if you look at the relatives of cases, you'll find a high generalized anxiety disorder. So I think probably it belongs there, though I must admit I'm not really that much in favor of these DSM rubrics of anxiety, OCD, etc. to start with. So I don't know where it will end up, but I think we have to go both ways. We have to look at these things broadly, and we have to look at these things narrowly before we can decide.
Thanks. Other folks? Well, I have a, did I see a hand
Someone
somewhere? Dr. Kolek.
Yes, we actually developed a committee to do DBS 15 years ago, and we did one case then. We've since, I mean, it was just not going very far in that particular domain. It is an effective treatment for OCD, and other institutions are using it quite freely. Here at Hopkins, I think people in the neurology department are considering it, and that's where I refer people for DBS here. Though if people in psychiatry are interested, not me, it would be a very good thing to be doing.
Dr. DePaula.
Jerry, you mentioned that the striatal circuits seem to be very important here, and they do seem to be important actually in other psychiatric illnesses. How about neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease or Huntington's? Do they have an association with OCD?
Do neurologic disorders have increased rates of OCD?
Years ago, I published a paper with an Italian group who were looking at Huntington's, and we did find that there was an association with Huntington's. I bet the Huntington's people, probably in this crowd, probably know more than me about that, but we have found that. Haven't found anything with Parkinson's, though it seems strange that we haven't.
Dr. Margolis, any information on increased OCD in Huntington's? No comment. Okay, well, I'm going to ask one last question, the last second, and that is, do SSRIs have any, when used to treat OCD, do they also have any impact on OCPD?
I have found that they do, and I do use them for that.
So they reduce obsessive personality traits.
They do. I don't know how substantially, just...
But in your experience, they do.
My
Okay.
experience,
Okay.
and I think Dr. Bienvenu found for me, but this was years ago, there's probably something since then, how SSRIs actually reduced neuroticism in a study, which was probably an interesting finding. I don't know if it's ever been pursued.
Interesting.
It's a related
Okay.
answer.
Thanks. Here's to several dozen more grand rounds going forward. Thank you.